alzato. Oh bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Stamattina mi sono alzato e ho trovato l'invasor. Partigiano, portami via. Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morir. Partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morir. Se io muoio, tuo partigiano, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Se io muoio da partigiano, tu mi devi seppellire. Seppellire sulla montagna. Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Seppellire sulla montagna sotto l'ombra d'un bel fiore.
Hello and welcome to Captive Minds. I'm Shaenah Batterson and will be your host for the day. I'm a writer with a Substack page called The Red Letter. With me, as usual, is my co-host Max Perry, who is an independent journalist currently syndicated with Covert Action magazine. Hi, Max.
Hey, Shaenah, and everybody watching. Good to be back.
Today, we thought it would be timely to do an episode about fascism, though maybe not in the way that people might expect, and also at the end talk a little bit about Antifa. Two recent events inspired the subject, one being Trump's designation of Antifa as a terrorist organization, and another being Kamala Harris calling Trump a communist dictator. Unfortunately, Harris's remarks show the ubiquity of the liberal discourse, which conflates fascism and communism, because the liberal view of fascism is that it's this authoritarian state of exception, and communism is the same, and they all fall under this umbrella of totalitarianism. Whereas instead, I think we should talk about the Marxist conception of fascism, which is that fascism is sort of the response of the bourgeoisie when capitalism falls into a crisis and is still part of capitalism. It's not some exception from it, but rather, as I said, the bourgeoisie's strategy to prevent revolution, to prevent an economic crisis from. It is the difference between bourgeois democracy and fascism and which is deployed sort of depends on the internal situation of the country and the population. The bourgeois democracy isn't a bulwark against fascism because oftentimes fascism can grow out of that. It's more like when the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie is dressed up nicely rather than being more overt and in your face. I like to use the definition of fascism that the Bulgarian communist Georgy Dimitrov gave, which was, quote, "Fascism is the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinist, most imperialist elements of finance capital," close quote.
I think that's accurate. I mean, there's also there was the British communist leader R. Palm Dutt, who was affiliated with the Communist Party of Great Britain in its heyday, gave a similar definition in his book, Fascism and Social Revolution, I believe it's called, which is a underappreciated book in my opinion. But I mean, I think what you were saying is accurate, and there are big distinctions to be made between those definitions of fascism. I mean, I think we need to have a grasp of what we're talking about when we say fascism, because, like you said, there are varying definitions. It's sort of similar to a political concept like imperialism, which I think, for example, most people, I think imperialism just assume that it means like when one country conquers another or something like that, which is part of it. But whereas from a Marxist perspective, there's an actual understanding of it economically and specifically as a stage of capitalism, like Lenin said, imperialism being the highest stage of capitalism, that a capitalist country has reached a certain stage where it needs to go out and acquire resources. But the same goes for fascism. There's a sort of general conception, popular conception that people think of that you're alluding to, which I think is really the result of things we've discussed before on this podcast, not just something like Hannah Arendt's origins of totalitarianism, but all, in general, I think a lot of the ideas, this conception that came out of the New Left, really, but also like more specifically the thinkers that influenced the New Left, namely the Frankfurt School critical theorists, who merged, Freudian psychology with sort of a watered down version of Marxism, in my opinion. I mean, they sort of hollowed out or evacuated the economic understanding that classical Marxism provided of fascism. And I think that their methodology sort of led the most prominent thinkers like Adorno and Marcuse specifically to reduce fascism to this sort of psychosexual mindset, or somehow like we've discussed in previous episodes, the somehow that fascism is like the apotheosis of when a society is organized around rationality and instrumental reason, that it leads to this. I mean, Adorno wrote a book called The Authoritarian Personality that was very influential in the social sciences, and I think really exemplified this kind of outlook on fascism and this reduction of it to personality traits. And in the book, Authoritarian Personality, there's like a actual personality test that they came up with. I mean, he wrote that book with a group of other people, including the psychologist Nevitt Sanford. But there's a personality test in it called the F scale, which basically measures one's attitudes towards authority, where this idea that the authoritarian personality or pre-fascist personality, I think they called it, is characterized by this criteria or personality dimensions, like one who conforms to middle-class values, strict adherence to religion and ethics, rigid thinking in categorical terms, belief in simple or prejudiced thinking, a belief in superstitions. I mean, there's a whole list. I think there's like nine characteristics that it lists. And if you have any of these traits, you have an authoritarian personality and therefore susceptible to fascism or anti-democratic propaganda. And this was the explanation for why, I mean, they did this study in order to determine why the German people supported Hitler, why they were anti-Semitic, and that it was somehow reducible to their personality structures.
Those are great points. I just wanted to say that I think it's an as to me it's an especially problematic approach, like with you were saying with the F scale and all this, because it places the blame of fascism on just individual people. Oh, they have bad personalities, instead of seeing it as a superstructural, or not a superstructural phenomena, a structural phenomena, a structural response of capitalism in a crisis or the potential threat of revolution. Instead, it again, it sees as like these personality flaws or this madness of the masses.
Yeah, I mean, think about the implications. I mean, in regard to the general population, like what you're saying about the masses, like not only is it incredibly cynical, but it basically implies that anyone who's conservative or old-fashioned is a fascist, and they claim to be trying to come up with a scientific method to study prejudice and hatred. But in my view, it's as pseudoscientific as it gets. And by the way, that study, like I said, it was done in collaboration with a few people, but one of whom was Nevitt Sanford, who was an American professor of psychology at UC Berkeley. And for a while, he was a research affiliate at the Tavistock Institute in Britain. And that's actually the source for, I think, one of the sources for why there's all these like crazy conspiracy theories on the right about, because there's this suspicion that the Tavistock Institute, like its social engineering stuff, was like involved with British intelligence. And that's also where there's all the theories that like, the Tavistock Institute invented rock and roll and that Adorno wrote the lyrics for the Beatles and stuff. That's where that whole thing comes from, which is obviously, that's a bunch of LaRoucheite nonsense. But I mean, there is like probably tiny little nuggets of truth. I mean, it does seem like there's some link between Tavistock and the Tavistock Institute and British intelligence. But that study, I think more importantly, it was the authoritarian personality study was sponsored by the OSS, which was the CIA's wartime predecessor. But anyway, more importantly, I think that this sort of psychologized interpretation or concept of fascism, like you were saying, it totally obscures the Marxist understanding, which is that when capitalism enters a crisis, there's a section of the ruling class that attempts to seize power or control of the state in order to stabilize the economy, to get it out of the crisis. And it uses mass political repression, not only to crush the left, but also to restart the economy. And usually there's some sort of partnership with the old elite or like the aristocracy. In the case of Germany, that was certainly the case. It obscures the what Lenin said about fascism is capitalism and decay. Or he's attributed to have said. I mean, the Frankfurt School, I think, completely abandoned the traditional Marxist sociological and economic explanation for human behavior in favor of these very, I mean, frankly, crackpot like psychological explanations. And it's not really much of a surprise considering that one of the people involved, even though he was sort of the outlier among the Frankfurt School, I suppose, but nevertheless, he was part of that milieu, and I believe even the authoritarian personality cites him in places, but Wilhelm Reich, who was a former student of Freud and an Austrian psychologist. I mean, I know they say that his views evolved over time. There's a lot of people that try and his defenders like try and truncate his early work from his later really out there stuff, when he went totally off the deep end. But I think if you look at his early work, the signs, were all there. I mean, I guess he did have a period where he was more Marxist, so to speak, in terms of advocating like a workers' democracy, or that, we need to have, or the people that do the work need to be in control of political power. But nevertheless, he was one of the people that was, he wrote a book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism. And actually, coincidentally, I recently watched a Serbian film called WR, Wilhelm Reich, and WR Mysteries of the Organism is what it's called, which is a very interesting film. I recommend to people. I mean, it's part documentary and partly dramatized. One part is a presentation on Wilhelm Reich's life and his work using like clips from, I guess, his early research. And the other is like this fictional story about this Yugoslavian girl who falls in love with this Russian figure skater who she sees as like a Stalin-like figure. It's actually a very funny film, but I mean, Wilhelm Reich was very, very critical of the Soviet Union, and this film by the Serbian filmmaker is very, very critical of the communist government in Yugoslavia. It's clearly meant to criticize the communist government and society and socialist Yugoslavia in general. That it's because Wilhelm Reich's ideas were all about that sexual repression is what led to fascism, and this film is very much making that sort of critique of communist states. I mean, like I said, Reich was very critical of communist states like the USSR, and this film is sort of talking about. I mean, it came out in 1971, so it's it very much shows the influence of like the 1960s New Left, which did spread, to places like not just Yugoslavia but Czechoslovakia and so on. And it's basically, like the main girl character, she plays like this communist that's basically arguing that we don't have real communism here. In order to have real political liberation, we need to embrace sexual liberation. And the movie's kind of like about the relationship between communist politics and sexuality. And it was actually subsequently banned in Yugoslavia. The filmmaker, Dusan Makavejev, if I'm saying it correctly, was actually exiled from Yugoslavia over it. And the film is very funny. I mean, it's a satire, but it almost like in hindsight feels almost like also like a satire of the like Reich's influence on the counterculture or the 60s and like free love and sexual liberation movements. Because for those who don't know, Reich specifically did a lot of work on human sexuality and had a number of, like I was saying, pseudoscientific crackpot ideas, particularly about bioenergy and the relationship between the human mind and body. And he had this is later on in his work. He developed these ideas that there was like this life force or esoteric energy, and that the libido was like a life force, a universal life force repressed by society. And he actually came up with these devices, most famously the orgone accumulator, but also these other devices called cloud busters that were like almost like this lightning rod that would get pointed at the sky that he claimed could like induce rain or produce rain by manipulating this orgone energy. If you've ever heard the Kate Bush song Cloud Busting, it's about this. But he also had the orgone accumulator, which was this, I think, like six-sided box-like device, which was made out of both organic and metal material. And the idea was that you would sit in the box and he would put his patients in these boxes to harness orgone, this cosmic vital energy or universal life force that he claimed had like healing properties, that it could cure cancer, and that the blocking of it was what was causing people's mental illnesses and psychological problems and their physical problems as well. And this was like kind of a fad for a while. I mean, he was eventually convicted of defrauding people with these quack devices, but I don't want to get too much into that. But my point is that this is who the Frankfurt School was, for a time at least, associated with and even cited at times. And he wrote a book, this is earlier on, he wrote a book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism, which attempts to explain that fascists and authoritarians come to power because of this sexual repression of the masses. The Mass Psychology of Fascism, it was written sometime before he later embraced the pseudoscientific stuff, like the orgone energy. And like I was saying, people try and like truncate his earlier work from the later stuff. But I'm not sure you can really do that. And to be honest, the signs were there from the beginning. I mean, he was in some respects a Marxist, at least for a period. But I think even in his work on fascism and sexual repression, this idea that Germany descended into authoritarianism was because of sexual repression. I mean, he is just. I mean, the reductionism. I mean, he tried to connect political power and repression and sexual repression of children. That sexual repression of children made people grow up to be docile and obedient, that they just go along with authoritarian regimes. Now, whether or not Germany at that time, German society was heavily sexually repressed is one thing. I'm sure it's true. I mean, I'm sure that was even the case for communist Yugoslavia to an extent. But the idea that this was the reason for the rise of Hitler, I mean, is another. I mean, he thought that the swastika was like a sexual fertility symbol, that it was two human figures copulating and therefore like subliminally invoked the sex act to co-opt the repression of the masses into, bowing before Hitler. I mean, that the masses were sexually frustrated and then they therefore channeled their sexual frustration into xenophobia and racism and nationalism. I mean, this is just ridiculous stuff.
Yeah, that's
But
I mean,
nevertheless, this is one of the people who was affiliated with the Frankfurt School, and I think that certainly Adorno was a lot better than Wilhelm Reich, but you can see like the filtering of some of those ideas and the influence there. There's some overlap.
well, I was gonna say, I think that it's the sort of the phrase that anti-Semitism is like a disguised form of anti-capitalism. That applies, in my mind, more to what happened in Nazi Germany, that there had been the war and an economic crisis, and it became fascism with this sort of pseudo-populist veneer about it, and then all the rhetoric about the Jewish bankers, it appealed, people sensed something about res- the ruling class and capitalism, but then in fascism, it gets distorted and turned into oftentimes racist ideologies. And meanwhile, the financial powers are still in power, and it's not any real threat to capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, Michael Parenti has a great thing about that, Fascism, the False Revolution, which we'll put a link to. But that's absolutely accurate. And I think in regard to Weimar Germany, I mean, whether or not there were cultural factors or that some role was played by in their particular society, the repression or I mean, there are a number of different countries, that where you could argue like have an especially rigid or conformist culture or whatever. But I mean, the idea that that's the explanation for why, especially under the circumstances, I mean, with Weimar Germany, the economic crisis, I mean, they've done numerous studies, academic studies, showing how it was actually the implementation of austerity measures that led the Nazis to come to power and produce and reinforced a lot of the scapegoating of immigrants. And because Nazi Germany became a country where not it didn't just practice expansionism in its foreign policy, but inward it led this campaign of like purification and the economic factor, the economic explanation, the consequences for what this kind of stuff that came out of the new left, it really sort of evacuated that and sort of obscured that much more, how do you say, I mean, much more reasonable explanation for it. I mean, this kind of stuff is just, but nevertheless, this is what became popularized. And I think that's, and obviously someone like Hannah Arendt in her work as well had probably even more of a negative influence in terms of conflating the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and I certainly think that dialectic of enlightenment and the work that the Frankfurt School did also had a negative impact in terms of that. But actually, that's sort of perfect timing because I wanted to play a clip. Recently, there's been a lot of hysteria to some degree in response to the Trump administration and a lot of the policies that it's enacting. And I don't mean to diminish how scary some of them are or how serious some of them are or trivialize any of the things that are happening right now. I certainly don't mean to say that. But nevertheless, we need to, I think, diagnose what's going on. I mean, we need to diagnose it not only accurately, but I think a lot of these comparisons being made with Nazi Germany are not always helpful in terms of accurately assessing this new right-wing populism, or even what's taking place in the United States right now, generally with the Trump administration. And I think a perfect example of this was in April, former Vice President Al Gore was speaking at a climate gathering in San Francisco, and he gave a speech where he was, yes, on the one hand, he was speaking out against Trump's immigration policies, and which, by the way, were terrible under the Clinton administration as well. So I don't know how he's in any position to criticize what Trump is doing. But nevertheless, he was criticizing the xenophobia and the scapegoating of immigrants and Trump's dog whistling and all that. But the context of this speech that he gave was this happened in April during the ongoing peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, mediated by the United States. And Trump, throughout his candidacies and his presidency, has been widely criticized for occasionally making at least rhetorical efforts at rapprochement with Russia, or has at least expressed sympathy for some of their grievances, like, for example, in terms of the NATO expansion. And basically, during the Ukraine negotiations, he alluded to the fact that Ukraine started the war and that Russia was provoked into doing what it's doing with its special military operation and so on and so forth. So he was being diplomatic with Russia. And of course, the media and liberals were up in arms that he was breaking from the foreign policy orthodoxy. And so in this speech, Al Gore he was attacking Trump for his immigration policies and all that, but he was also responding to Trump saying that Ukraine started the war with Russia, which is, of course, something that is true. It's been argued by international relations scholars, for God's sake. But nevertheless, I wanted to play this clip because I think it's very telling, because Al Gore, well, anyway, I'll just play it here.
The scale and scope of the ongoing attacks on liberty are literally unprecedented. With that in mind, I want to note that before I use what is not a precedent, I understand very well why it is wrong to compare Adolf Hitler's Third Reich to any other movement. It was uniquely evil, full stop. I get it. But there are important lessons from the history of that emergent evil, and here is one that I regard as essential. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, a small group of philosophers who had escaped Hitler's murderous regime returned to Germany and performed a kind of moral autopsy on the Third Reich. The most famous of the so-called Frankfurt School of philosophers was a man named Jürgen Habermas, best known, I would say, but it was Habermas's mentor, Theodor Adorno, who wrote that the first step in that nation's descent into hell was, and I quote, the conversion of all questions of truth into questions of power. He described how the Nazis, and I quote again, attacked the very heart of the distinction between true and false.
Okay, just think about that. This is a former vice president of the United States citing the Frankfurt School and Adorno in a speech to attack Trump for acknowledging that Ukraine and NATO expansion provoked Russia into intervening in Ukraine. So take from that what you will. Now I know, of course, like just the fact that there's people who would say, okay, well, Al Gore is just misappropriating that quote. It doesn't mean that the Frankfurt School are not real Marxists, but you're not going to, I'm sorry, you're not going to see Al Gore quoting Lenin. You're not going to see Al Gore quoting Marx and Engels. You're certainly not going to see him quoting Arpam Dutt's Fascism and Social Revolution. I think that it speaks volumes. But, in the speech, Gore at this climate gathering, by the way, Al Gore is famous for having made a documentary about climate change, which has all kinds of predictions that did not come true, that proved to be false. So here he is talking about how Trump is attacking the very nature of true and false. Out of all things that Trump says, now Trump does say a number of things, obviously, that are not true. I mean, he routinely lies about stuff. But out of all things that he chooses to attack him for, the context of the full speech, you can watch it. He was going after him because he was saying that Ukraine provoked Russia. That's what he's saying, that Trump is attacking the very nature of true and false.
The clip you played, it reminds me, I've been seeing all these signs around town that Trump is a traitor. And that is sort of, in a sense, the liberal view of fascism. It's somehow a traitorous movement to bourgeois democracy. Instead of it's a logical continuation. And in no way is Trump a traitor to the US empire of imperial expansion. Another thing, though, that I wanted to briefly mention is that another thing that I think gets forgotten when fascism gets discussed is that, in a sense, fascism is, to sort of paraphrase Fanon, it's what has been practiced by colonialism for a long time, just brought home to the imperial core. And as Domenico Lacerda has written about a lot, Hitler actually viewed the system of white supremacy in the United States and the extermination of the indigenous as a model for the Third Reich. And also, when I was preparing for this episode, I listened to some talk that Gabriel Rockhill was giving, and he brought up this idea he had, and I thought this was interesting. He was talking about how even within the imperial core, even during periods of liberal democracy, there are certain sections of the population that live under even though they're living under the same state, their treatment is more akin to what people would deem as fascism. Like, for example, undocumented immigrants, the homeless.
Well, the reason I played that Al Gore clip, I mean, I think it's the perfect example of someone giving sort of this obscure definition of fascism. And I mean, I suppose I should explain. I mean, for people who don't know, in case people don't know, like he was saying, the Frankfurt School, they were a group of German philosophers associated with the Institute for Social Research, based in Frankfurt, Germany. Actually, Wilhelm Reich, I think he was Austrian. Actually, he was from Galicia, which at the time when he was born, was under the control of the Habsburg monarchy, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and became at one point Poland, but it's Ukraine. Now it's considered Western Ukraine. But anyway, as a group of intellectuals, they were collectively forced into exile when the Nazis came to power, and who shut down the institute in Frankfurt. Some of them, like Herbert Marcuse, came to the United States
and worked for the OSS.
Yes, he worked for the Marcuse
and the
worked for
State Department.
and the State Department. But the whole thing is that they're witnessing the rise of the Nazis, led them to become very cynical and pessimistic about the nature of human progress, or the Enlightenment's notion of ever improving humanity, like that history, the classical Marxist notion that history is a train moving forward toward a future goal, teleologically, that history is progressing forward linearly towards a classless society and a materialist realization of freedom. The Frankfurt School had a very critical viewed that very critically after the fascism and the Holocaust, and they started to dispute the idea that humanity's development was rational and universal. And then they incorporated the influence of Freudian psychoanalysis and his insights, which of course had a very pessimistic view of the masses. Because I mean, they also felt that, and to some extent this is true. I mean that mass societies had caused community to have been lost, which I do think is to some extent one of the things that something like fascism, when it came along, it was at least offering. But again, they removed this sort of economic component of that explanation.
Well, too, I would add that Nazi Germany, I mean, we got into this in the episode about surrealism. It wasn't this rational society that it has been portrayed as. It's actually all about German folk and witches and the folk tales, and it had this sort of pagan aspect. Most people think it was just like, oh, white Christian nationalism, basically. But there was this other aspect to it.
Yeah, which is another big thing now, that this whole idea that the United States is mirroring Nazi Germany by becoming a Christian fascist state, or something, which whether or not the US is becoming a Christian fascist state is one thing, but then saying that that's what happened in Nazi Germany is also not entirely accurate. So, yeah, I mean, we talked about the occult influence on the Nazis, and that any sort of outwardly Christian sort of values they claim to espouse was clearly purely cosmetic.
Yeah, this might be a good segue to the lesser covered aspect of the Holocaust, where a lot of Orthodox Christians, like in Serbia, for example, were actually killed. And can you talk a little bit about, although on the other hand, the priests working?
Well, yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, I would say that the most of all the countries in Europe that were devastated by, or that were impacted by the Holocaust, the one that always gets the least amount of attention seems to be the former Yugoslavia. I mean, historically, it's no secret that fascism and the Catholic Church had a very cozy relationship at the time, and or at least in the early day, like with Mussolini's ascent to power, because the church really used Mussolini and vice versa for their respective political gain, and for the relationship was mutually beneficial, because at the time there was what was called the Roman question. Basically, in Italy, I believe it was in the late 1800s or mid 1800s, Italy had become reunified in what was called I think it's the Risorgimento, the reunification. And what happened was that there was a disagreement between Italy and the papacy about the Italy's seizure of Rome and the papal states, which were previously under the control of the Pope, and included what's modern Rome. And so there was like this dispute from the mid to late 1800s to 1929, when they signed what was called the Lateran Pacts, which settled that dispute between the church and state in Italy. And the Lateran Treaty was an agreement basically between fascist Italy. Mussolini became dictator, I think, in 1922. But it was an agreement between fascist Italy and the Holy See, or the Catholic Church, that created Vatican City. And Pope Pius the 11th, I believe it was, yeah, I think it was the 11th, cooperated with Mussolini to protect the church's interests. Only later did he come out against Mussolini and was critical of the Nazis. And to be fair, he did get pushback from the more conservative factions of the Vatican that wanted him to stay silent. I mean, like I was saying earlier, one of the defining traits, I would say, of fascism is that, you know, when the ruling class does this, the right-wing forces, you know, there's this temporary alliance, or this relationship of convenience with sort of like the old establishment or old elite, or the aristocracy, and the church also played kind of a similar role. And I think that's what took place in Italy with the Vatican's early support for fascism for its own interests. Pope Pius the 12th, his successor, was even worse and was just totally strategically neutral. He completely stayed silent during the Holocaust. And I mean, they've tried to, in recent years, there's been like some historically revisionist accounts, like with new documents or records that have been opened or whatever, trying to say that he was secretly helping Jews, like through a back channel with Hitler. But it's pretty clear what the Vatican's wartime activities were. And the perfect example, I mean, in particular, the role that the church played, like in these, you know, as the Nazis expanded their empire in the puppet states. And one of them was the independent state of Croatia, the Ustaše regime. You know, Croats are Catholic, and under the Ustaše, there was not just mass murder of Orthodox Christian Serbs, but also, I mean, yes, Jews too, but the majority of victims in the former Yugoslavia were Slavs and Orthodox Christians. And so it, you know, just with the whole Holocaust narrative, you know, which has just been, I think, to some extent, you know, because the majority of victims were not Jewish, it doesn't get as much attention. And
Just
there was a lot of forced conversion of Orthodox Christians to Catholicism. I actually wrote a review of a Serbian film a few years ago that was very controversial because it was accurately depicting that. It was depicting the role. It was very scathing in how the role of the church in the Holocaust under the Ustaše. And however much that what went on there was sanctioned by the actual Holy See itself, or like the institution itself at large, I don't know, or that's debatable. But nevertheless, at least on the micro level, like within these individual countries, the church was very much involved in facilitating what these fascist states were doing, or their puppet states. So whether that was
just
officially sanctioned by the Vatican, I don't know, but it's pretty clear.
no, I was just gonna say, just for clarification, you know, the Ustaše were so brutal and ruthless that they even horrified the Nazis. Just to
Yeah,
give
just
people
the
some
extent that
idea.
their savagery was, yeah, was enough to even make the Nazis recoil with their cruelty and like the torture devices they came up with, and all kind, their methods of killing people were really inhumane. But anyway, there was after, you know, subsequently after the war, there were rat lines, some of which were supported by Croat clergymen as well, but priests from other countries as well. But one of the most prominent clergymen that were responsible for like these Nazi war criminals escaping to places like South America was this Croat priest named Krunoslav Draganovic. And it was through his network that Nazi figures like Klaus Barbie, who was the head of the Gestapo, they were smuggled to South America, in particular Argentina, but Klaus Barbie ended up in Bolivia, and he was actually, basically almost there on like a stay behind basis where he was reactivated by the CIA after the war for his anti-communist expertise, and he was employed by Western intelligence agencies. I mean, he even later, when he was very old, participated in like this CIA-backed military coup that established this junta regime in Bolivia in 1980 and put this Caudillo military dictator in power. So the clergy were involved in that. So the relationship between fascism and Catholicism is, I mean, historians have debated this very intensely, but the cowardice of the church at that time certainly can't be disputed. I think it's the extent to which the church was like operating out of fear is debatable. Whether I mean, there's people who like defend Pius, both the 11th and 12th, that they were outwardly supporting the Nazis, but like behind the scenes, they were secretly doing things to save Jews and whatnot. But it's pretty clear that they facilitated and didn't do nearly enough. And like I said, in some places like the Yugoslavia, we're outright collaborating in the Holocaust.
Yeah, it's especially interesting with the Catholic Church because then on the other hand, like in Latin America, you had liberation theology. So it's like these two almost opposite poles. That's the other thing about specifically, I guess, Nazi Germany is that a lot of the top people were appropriated by the United States. For example, like with Operation Paperclip, which was the covert operation that brought over around like 1,500 Nazi scientists to the US. Some of them were ardent Nazis, concentration camp overseers, SS members, and they were placed in pretty prominent positions like Werner von Braun, who directed the Marshall Space Flight Center, and he even did like a Walt Disney TV series. And then the first director of NASA's JFK Space Center in Florida was a man named Kurt H. I don't know how to say his last name, Debus, who was an SS officer with the rank of major, and also the later declassified records show that he turned in a colleague to the Gestapo for failing to salute him with the Sieg Heil, even though this information about him has been kept secret for years. And if you look on NASA's website, they still deny that he was part of the SS, even though there are other documents showing he was. But there was another notable incident that I'd like to mention involving US intelligence and the Nazis. In this case, I'm referring to Operation Sunrise. So Alan Dulles, who was a Nazi sympathizer because he believed that fighting the Nazis, well, it's kind of like fighting the wrong enemy. He really thought that the communists are who the U.S. needed to be fighting, but he was became the CIA's longest standing director, and he was the top OSS man in Europe during World War II. And Operation Sunrise was his attempt basically to negotiate a Nazi surrender in northern Italy. Dulles wanted to secure a separate peace with the Nazis before the Red Army could push southward through Austria and into Trieste, something which he was worried about because he was worried it would lead to Italy coming into the Soviet orbit, especially because the communists had played a significant part in the anti-fascist resistance. So he met with the SS General Karl Wolff, who was formerly Himmler's chief of staff, and also commander of the Nazi forces in Italy, to negotiate a deal, but it didn't, I mean, I can't remember the details, but I think word of it got out and to the Soviet Union, and I think Stalin called or corresponded with FDR going, wait, are you trying the suspicion was aroused, are you trying to secure a peace deal with the Nazis in general?
Well, the British wanted to have their, basically wanted to take all the German units after their surrender and then reactivate them and attack the Soviets. That was another operation, but I think it was aborted that the British were thinking about doing. The name of it escapes me, but yeah, I mean, in regard to the the Nazis being the rat lines transporting them to South America. I mean, there's even rumors, of course, that Hitler survived and lived and lived out the rest of his days in Argentina or whatever. But I mean, it is true that like even the ones that they didn't end up using, or at least they didn't get the chance to, like people like Klaus Barbie were employed by U.S. intelligence, but even like, okay, we were talking about Hannah Arendt earlier in Origins of Totalitarianism. Well, she was famous for her writings in regard to the trial of Adolf Eichmann. Well, Adolf Eichmann was only brought to trial in the early 60s, but when he was nabbed by the Mossad. And apparently the US had been fully aware that Eichmann was living in South America, and they were actually surprised when the Israelis apprehended him and brought him to trial. And he was one of the main architects of the Holocaust. And but they weren't even using him for anything, seemingly, at least not yet. Who knows what they had planned? But I mean, who knows? I mean, that's why you can't really blame people for thinking that Hitler escaped. And I mean, even Stalin wasn't fully convinced, that supposedly that Hitler had killed himself. And I mean, I know that they've done there were like DNA tests that came out recently, or tests that were done on like the teeth of the skull or whatever that prove that Hitler died or whatever. It does seem to put that whole question to rest. But nevertheless, yeah, these rat lines allowed a number of Nazi war criminals to escape, and they lived out their days, and many of them got away with it, I'm sure. I mean, one of them there also went to Chile and set up this cult, basically called Colonia Dignidad, that later became, the CIA backed a coup in the early 70s to overthrow Salvador Allende, who was a democratically elected socialist. And during the mass repression that occurred under Augusto Pinochet, the general that took power, this cult, its territory called Colonia Dignidad, that's where they did a lot of the torturing and things like that. There's both a documentary about it, and also they made a feature film even about it with Emma Watson. That's not bad. But yeah, Colonia Dignidad, you can look that up. That's another example. But yeah, I think one of the reasons we've been discussing all this is because, like Shaenah was saying at the beginning, there's some, the Trump administration has announced that they want to designate Antifa as a terrorist organization. And people, I think, sort of have a confused response to this, because on the one hand, it's very disturbing because Antifa, at least its current incarnation here in the United States, is not really a real organization per se. It's a very decentralized movement. There is seemingly some kind of organization in that there are local chapters claiming to be Antifa, and it's made up of a very loose association of people. Most of them, their political orientation, I suppose you could describe as anarcho-syndicalist or libertarian socialist or anarchist or whatever. I mean, to me, when you say Antifa, it's sort of synonymous politically with what they used to call the Black Bloc, which is sort of an anarchist street level, not gang, but like groups, street level groups that sort of came out of I would say like the punk scene in response to like, the presence of or unwanted presence of things like Nazi skinheads and whatnot. I first became aware of what they call the Black Bloc when I first started to become not politically active, but at least interested in politics. The first rumblings I remember hearing of the Black Bloc was like during, for example, things like the anti-WTO protests in Seattle and like sort of the anti-globalization movement. And they were actually known, or they developed a negative reputation for, like, for example, crashing peaceful protests, like the big ones in Seattle against the World Trade Organization, and conducting property damage and committing vandalism and throwing Molotov cocktails and otherwise disrupting what were peaceful demonstrations, which then proceeded to give the police the go ahead to crack down violently and swing batons at people and so on and so forth. And actually, during the WTO protests, I mean, I think there's even old Counterpunch newsletter article about it. During the Battle of Seattle, there was like rumors that the Black Bloc, there was, because of their whole nature, wearing masks, they're decentralized, nobody knows who they are. It was very susceptible to police infiltration. And so there was a lot of speculation that the crackdown on those protests was instigated by police purporting to be the members of the Black Bloc. Whether they actually were, I don't know. But it certainly makes sense to me. Flash forward around 2015 to 2016 election, like around the time that Donald Trump runs for president, you started to see a number of protests by Black Bloc type protest groups against, like, for example, right-wing media personalities speaking on U.S. college campuses, whether it was like the leader of the Proud Boys, Gavin McInnes, founder of the Proud Boys, excuse me, and co-founder of Vice, by the way. Gavin McInnes speaking at, I think it was NYU. Also, people like Milo Yiannopoulos speaking at Berkeley. You started to see these like kind of protests against I mean, we talked about that last week in the Culture War episode. They're speaking at college campuses across the U.S. and getting these protests in response, angry protests in response. And you started to see the formation of, or semi-formation of, what started to become called Antifa. And Antifa, this U.S. incarnation, has appropriated the flag of the old anti-fascist action, though they've inverted the colors. It's black and red. It's not red. Of the old Antifa, which was associated in Europe, specifically Germany, the Communist Party of Germany. It was like a militant faction, street level faction of Communist Party of Germany. And they were, I mean, I'm sure that there were anarchists and maybe syndicalists that were part of it, but it was much more associated with communism. This U.S., and there may even be other incarnations of Antifa, like in Europe, that I'm not aware of, that are still of that orientation. But this, what people have come to know as Antifa now here in the United States, which has a horrible reputation. I mean, they certainly seem a lot more interested in like harassing like turf academics for not thinking that transgender women are women or whatever, people not obeying COVID restrictions, engaging in these ridiculous street battles with groups like the Proud Boys, which are, I mean, if they're supposed to be a serious fascist street gang, I mean, it's pretty pathetic. I mean, their initiation is like saying the names of breakfast cereals and like punching each other. I mean, it's pretty pathetic. Like, I don't really think that the Proud Boys are like the modern Free Corps. I mean, if they are, I'm really not afraid. But anyway, like, for example, Antifa was like nowhere to be found. Like, for example, during this Ukraine war, where the United States is supplying arms to an actual militant neo-Nazi organization, the Azov Battalion. And in fact, most of the people that are associated with something like Antifa, like, for example, the Portland-based writer Alexander Reed Ross, who wrote this book, Against the Fascist Creep, where he basically calls people who are anti-imperialist, who defend Russia, or like, for example, didn't side with the Syrian opposition during the Syrian civil war, like that those are fascists. Just look up Alexander Reed Ross and his work and you'll see what I'm talking about. But you don't see Antifa concerned that the United States is arming neo-Nazis in Ukraine, a country where they're tearing down World War II memorials and erecting monuments to people who perpetrated the Holocaust. They're
Yeah, awarding national medals of honor to like Bandera and
yeah. I mean, it's so anyway, but nevertheless, like, as terrible as, I mean, not that I'm a fan of, like, I don't care about, not that I care that they're protesting people like Gavin McInnes and Milo Yiannopoulos, and people should protest them, though I think they have a right to speak on college campuses. But again, it's just like this very amateurish style of politics, and also their tactics are really bad, this sort of mindless violence without any sort of strategy. And I certainly disagree with they're doing stuff like, violence against people who don't agree with things like gender ideology. But nevertheless, Trump's threatening to designate them because as a terrorist organization is a very frightening development, because that could apply to you or me. That could apply to anyone that's actually, I mean, it's very nebulous. I mean, what does that even mean? Because it's not really a real organization, and clearly it's something that's going to be meant to repress the left at large, which is just only further reinforces why something like Antifa is just the perfect fodder for something
no,
like this.
yeah,
In fact, there was a White House anti-terror order that basically suggests that, it's expanding this whole definition of what domestic terrorism is. And like the indicators that it gives are like people who are anti-capitalist, So now anyone who's anti-capitalist is going to be regarded as a potential terrorist, which is really disturbing. So again, that's sort of I was trying to give the historical overview. I mean, people can look into it themselves, but like this modern US incarnation of Antifa, which is very loose knit and hard to pin down, though it does seem to have a kind of generalized tendency. But I think because of its very nature, it sort of lends itself to infiltration. I mean, I guarantee you I mean, we already know the Proud Boys are led by feds. I mean, the leader, Enrique Tarrio, was a federal informant. So we know that cops and stuff, and with January 6th, like all these right-wing groups are infiltrated by feds. So think it's pretty safe to assume that a lot of these people purporting to be Antifa are also, like, who know, like these street battles that have been filmed like in Portland and other places of Antifa versus the Proud Boys. It's probably like 50% cops versus cops, I'm not saying that there aren't genuine people out there purporting to be Antifa or whatever, but it seems very susceptible to that sort of thing.
I was gonna say, I think if anything, Antifa has really led a negative image to the left because they're just like just all in black out doing just like breaking windows or burning things or like punching people and whatnot.
throwing piss and shit at them. That was what they did to Gavin McInnes when he came to NYU. They were throwing urine and feces, and it's like, okay, well, I'm not going to lose any sleep. I don't like Gavin McInnes, but it's like, what is this? How is this even remotely serious? I mean, it's just like this. I mean, again, like it's just like the perfect thing for like the role that it served, like I was saying about when I first became aware of Antifa, or not Antifa, but the Black Bloc. It's basically just the Black Bloc rebranded.
Yeah.
They came to things like Iraq war protests also, but anti-globalization protests, and would just commit vandalism and property damage, and then the cops would have the pretext to come in and start beating people's heads in. And now it's just like this ultra left adventurous thing. And it's like what we've talked about with the years of lead, this American years of lead that's seemingly happening. It's just fueling this state response that's going to affect the left at large. And it is very disturbing what Trump is suggesting, classifying anyone who has views that are quote unquote anti-American or anti-capitalist, that they have a potential to be a terrorist, and it's just expanding this definition. It's very, very disturbing. It's just another aspect of what we've been talking about in previous episodes, like both the culture war episode and also the propaganda of the deed episode, that this really seems to be what the US is going through. But I think people need to be more aware of the difference between what Antifa was, anti-fascist action was historically, versus this current incarnation, which is really sketchy. And
Yeah, I know. During COVID, some woman in Oregon had been like, she was like holding a sign about masks, criticizing the mask mandate, and like some Antifa person ended up, I think, like breaking her jaw or something for just peaceably protesting. Like, this is not the kind of thing that's making the left look good. It's just going to further alienate people. And I just think that it's, I'm sure that there are genuine people in Antifa, but it's the perfect, especially since it is loose, it's perfect for feds and agent provocateurs to get in there. And
yeah, and of course it sounds like a good thing. I mean, again, like when you hear like them saying that they're going to designate Antifa as a terrorist organization, of course you think, God, so anyone who's anti-fascist is a terrorist? It's like, well, it's not that simple. It's more that this particular incarnation is like something else. But that's not what it's going to be. It's not going to be used to go after those kind of people exclusively. And not that they should even, but like it can be used as a pretext to crush the left, period. And yeah, it's a very disturbing development. And I think it's a logical outcome of like these kind of amateurish, adventurous politics. Um, and yeah, like the sort of mindless violence, um, and like street thuggery that's kind of like characteristic of it, I think is really ultimately very poisonous. And
if anything, I think it's showing again how historically over and over sort of the anarchist theory of these propaganda of the deed acts is it is disproven, because it seems to just initiate a response of crackdown or generalized confusion and fear, and not really effectively do anything.
yeah, and they're going to use it to target a people with a wide range of political beliefs, and to criminalize dissent. And anyone can be, now these ideological markers that they're using now to say that, I mean, it's so broad and sweeping that like anyone who says anything that can or does anything that can be construed as anti-American or anti-capitalist I think even anti-Christian was one of the ones that they put in there in this White House anti-terror, or I mean, this is straight up McCarthyist level tactics. And
We're
of
gonna
course,
start going back having those like propaganda movies. I married a communist and the flames and the
yeah,
devil horns.
I mean, it's ridiculous. And of course, meanwhile, right-wing extremism is left, is being protected. I mean, in a sense, this is the state interfering on their side. But this kind of stuff this is the environment that we're in now, and it just seems like more and more incidents are fueling it. But I think it's related, that this measure by the Trump administration to designate something like Antifa as a terrorist organization really raises questions about and sort of the general political discourse right now about the Trump phenomenon and this administration, and how, I mean, the people really seem to be conscious of like what they're calling democratic backsliding, and that the this country is really economically going down the drain, and that there's just, with the immigration policy, the government shutdown, like that we're just really heading in a really bad direction. And that, of course, is true. But I think a lot of it more is a sign of course, the US empire losing its hegemony and the United States collapsing internally. Um, and, capitalism is in a crisis, and we need to have an economic understanding of why this is happening, whether it's fascism or not, whatever it is. Whatever you want to call what the US is going through right now, an economic understanding is what is needed, not this kind of like abstract notions of what authoritarianism is and the sort of personalities that produce it, or what's leading people to follow Trump like herded sheep. It's
Well, in some ways that then relates back to Antifa because I would say that, or at least the people that are genuine in Antifa, it's that misconception of what fascism is. It's just these sort of petty ideologues or these bigoted people that they're the fascists, and instead of understanding the social phenomena and the economic aspects of what fascism is. Because if you don't understand that, you're not going to effectively fight it.
Yeah, and it's also a reflection of that pessimistic view of the masses, where, I mean, we were talking about the Frankfurt School earlier. I mean, they did believe in social transformation, but they did not believe that the working class were the engine for that change any longer after what happened in Europe. Particularly Marcuse, who very much influenced the New Left to elevate students and marginalized groups and racial minorities as the force for revolutionary social change.
And I can't help but see how this, what I would say, and I've written about it before, is sort of like the left's abandonment of the working class has then led to in my opinion, sort of led to the whole Trumpism phenomenon, this resurgence of right-wing populism, because these people have nowhere else to turn to. So if fascism does come out of that, like I would say that this sort of these new left people are somewhat bear the blame for that then.
Absolutely. And the question that I think, the left needs to wrestle with in terms of how do we respond to, or what's the way out from what people are calling fascism. I mean, to me, it's unquestionably a return in some form to working class based politics. But the United States is so backwards, we don't even have organized labor right now, really. I mean, it's starting to come back. It's being forced to by the circumstances of how difficult it is to live in this country. But it's coming back at a snail's pace. I mean, yes, it's great that Amazon workers are unionizing, and and things like that. But, to really combat the Trump phenomenon, and it's not like I'm saying inherently that trade unionism is radical, but it's like that's how so backwards we are here. It's like we don't even have that, we don't have. This isn't like in Europe. We're stuck in this backward shit, but like baby steps here, have to be taken, and certainly most importantly, breaking from the two major parties towards some kind of independent left, at least, like in the 1930s, where, yeah, like the Communist Party didn't take power, but at least it had a tremendous influence on the social gains that were made under, the New Deal, and we don't, I mean, we don't even have multi-party democracy here in this country. I mean, it's again, like there are steps that have to be taken here, considering how backwards the political situation is in this country. And I certainly think people who are calling for a more working class based politics and away from the identity politics and all that are on the right track. And it's a good first step, as impossible as it seems right now with this political situation. But
I mean, if anything, it's a perfect opportunity for a real left to emerge, because as Trump isn't fulfilling any of his campaign promises except more money for Israel, and as the Democratic Party becomes more and more this backwards clown show, I think there will be some sort of a reckoning.
yeah, I think it's coming. Hopefully, it seems sort of inevitable, and things typically have to get worse before they get better. But I think whenever something like this happens, like with Trump issuing making this sweeping broad designation of something like Antifa as a terrorist organization, it's a very disturbing development, but people need to look at it soberly and be prepared for what's coming down the pipe, because it's not good. It really seems like there's an concerted effort to use what's happening to crack down on freedom of speech, and that's why the left is always the first to go.
That poem, first they came for the communists, then they
Yeah,
came for the socialists, and it goes on until, oh, they came for me.
yeah, exactly. I think this has been a good discussion. I mean, I think there are any number of directions that we could have gone with it, but I think we did a good job. Do you have any final thoughts, Shaenah?
No, I don't.
Okay, that's okay. If you're watching on YouTube, please remember to hit like and subscribe. We have a Substack. It's shaenahbatterson.substack.com. If you're watching us on Substack, we have a YouTube channel. It's Captive Minds Pod. And also you can follow us on X at our account there as well. It's Captive Minds X. Thank you for watching. We'll be back soon with another episode, possibly an interview with a guest. Stay tuned. Thank you for watching and listening to Captive Minds.